we have three journalists. I'd like to introduce you to Valeria. She's a columnist at Milenio, a Mexican news outlet focused on economic matters, and she works both in print and TV. We also have Joe Fryer. He's an American journalist working for NBC News, and he reports for Today Show, NBC Nightly News, and MSNBC. And finally, we have Carol Massar, an award-winning American journalist working for Bloomberg Media. She also provides analysis of major economic, business, and social trends. So thank you all for taking the time to join us today. It's great to have you. So I'm gonna jump right in and ask, what has it been like to cover this moment? So this is I don't know if there's anything else right now but COVID and COVID-related issues. What has it been like for you all to cover this moment?
I can go first. It's definitely, I've been doing this for 20 years now, and it's definitely unlike anything we've ever seen in that it is, for the most part, the only story. I'd say 90–95% of the coverage we do, if not more, is strictly this, and it impacts every single beat, every single topic a person who's a journalist can explore. If you cover politics, it covers that. If you're a health reporter, obviously it covers that. If you're business or technology, it goes into that. If you talk about religion, then there's angles for you. Sports, there's angles for you, though maybe not as interesting as normal. Climate. And so that's what's been fascinating to me, is it's so all-consuming, but really is what journalism is all about, is that we have this topic that everyone can cover and be a part of.
Valeria?
I think that Carl was starting to say something. Sorry, Carl.
No, that's okay. I just, we're all learning about technology, and sometimes I get it right, sometimes I don't. So go ahead.
I feel the same way.
That's part of our new world.
I know. Well, let me give you just a brief comment. I'm an economist by training, so I usually report about economic issues. But being a weekly columnist and I'm daily on radio, suddenly you start to talk about many other stuff. You start talking about GDP, and suddenly you're talking about, sick people and hospital beds and ventilators and many other things. And that makes it complicated, because suddenly you are being an economist, but a journalist, but a nurse, but an epidemiologist, and you start to mix stuff, and you have to learn, and you have to be very, very, very responsible and very careful with all the data that you're handling, because there are many numbers, a lot of information. The information is not crystal clear. We all demand very clear information, and we have to realize that we don't have it. At least from my point of view in Mexico, you want to know, I don't know, how many deaths there have been. You don't have that number. It's incredible, but we don't have that number. We have some numbers. You have the government numbers, but we know they are not the real numbers. So you have to try to get the real numbers. And suddenly people start to realize that there are many numbers available. So as a journalist trying to cover all the aspects of this pandemic, it becomes really complicated. And, it's like a source of kind of stress and responsibility that you have to be very careful. I mean, you always have to be very careful, but now especially because you're talking about the lives of people, you have to be very responsible of the numbers that you use and how to use them.
So I'm going to jump in now that I have my audio and video working. It is media. I think Valeria is so right, because it's interesting. If we say something, social media is very quick to respond and say, well, wait a minute, did you guys think about, like, if you use the word testing just kind of generally, you have to think about, are you talking about antibodies? Are you, like, what specifically are you talking about? And people will hold you accountable for this. It's interesting today, we have the Moderna story, and the markets are just taking off like crazy, the financial markets, the equity markets. And I had somebody on Twitter say, well, wait a minute, it's a long way to go. They haven't started phase 3 testing. I mean, we have an informed public also. And so they will kind of hold your feet to the fire if you're not careful about what you're presenting. And they're like, well, you guys need to challenge these people who are coming on and getting so excited. And so in some ways, I feel like the interaction with public is more so than ever. I love that, because I love kind of getting that feedback and kind of playing off of it. but that has really definitely, I think, changed our world. Everybody's at home and they're listening to stuff, they're reading a lot of information. And so I think you're absolutely right that you really have to make sure you get it correct. I mean, you'll have to do that all the time, but I really think people are very quick to call you on it if you get it wrong.
That's great. I'm going to actually come back to one of the things you just raised, and I want to get a sense of what it's like for the audience to be at home and sequestered in homes. But before I go there, I'm curious what it's like for you. What challenges does the physical limitations, the social kind of distancing create for you in terms of access to information or resources, or going out and talking to people, having people like in person you can engage with? What kind of limitations have you all faced as a function of the social distancing and the other things that have been put in place to slow the spread of the disease?
I can say for me, it's been a drastic change. Typically, I am on the road, traveling, flying to other cities, I'd say 40% of the time. And I haven't been on an airplane since March 13th. So that's obviously a huge change. Typically, we go places to interview people in person, to get video of them doing whatever our story is about. Suddenly, that's completely off limits. So for starters, that's the biggest difference. The good news is we can still reach out to people. We can still contact people through phone, through email, through whatever your methods are to get information. But just as probably most viewers have noticed, so many of our interviews are now done via Zoom or Skype or something like that, and they're recorded. That's actually okay. I mean, it is a little different interviewing someone this way, but it's pretty similar. The larger challenge is like when we put together a television story, you don't just have the sound bites from the people you interview, you have the part where you hear my voice, the track, and the things we're explaining, and you have to cover that with video. That's actually the hardest thing, is when you don't have a crew out in the field to actually shoot video of the various things. You kind of have to depend on getting video from the person you talk to, or pulling things from social media, or using maybe photos that have been taken. So that's been a huge challenge. And then the other aspect that everyone's sort of dealing with is when you're working from home, we're actually broadcasting live from home. So I don't know what Carol's experience has been, but I actually do my live shots often from literally right here with a light. I use an iPhone to actually broadcast my live shots. And we sort of learned we can do that. It's not always perfect, but instead of me having a cameraman and an audio person and a producer, it's just me here sort of setting up my own shot at 4 in the morning if it's the Today Show. So that has been an adjustment, but we've also learned that we can do it. And in the recent weeks, we have started to loosen up a little. I've gone in the field in Southern California to shoot things as long as it's outside, as long as we can keep at least 6 feet from the people we talk to. So we're seeing small ways of starting to return to normal, but still being very cautious.
But Joe, aren't you amazed, if I can just jump in, aren't you amazed? Like, I am floored. I just jumped off my live radio show. It's a 4-hour show. We do it every day. I've got this little, 4x6-inch box that just taps into our network, and we do it. And it's amazing. I've got a little video conference so I can see my co-host who's back in Westchester, so we can kind of play off each other with physical cues. And it's amazing how well and how quickly we were able to figure it out. And I don't know how you feel, but I'm just amazed at even all the TV networks, how everybody has quickly figured this out and is, kind of filling out their schedules like pre-virus.
It was stunning to me how quickly we moved to work from home. And so say, for example, if I had a story on Nightly News tonight, I'd be working from home here. My producer is in New York. The editor who's actually editing the spot is in Chicago at home, and everyone's literally putting together what we normally would all be in the same building, maybe editing. We've been able to do it all remotely, and we were doing it within a couple of weeks of everything really coming down, which was incredible. And most of the anchors, if you watch MSNBC or Nightly News, you may not realize they are at home, and it doesn't really look terribly different, but they are at home, which is stunning,
There's a great piece that 60 Minutes did last night with Katie Ter and
Tony DeCopel, yeah.
And it was just great because they're both in their basement in Brooklyn. They're both doing, CBS. He's doing CBS This Morning. She's doing her show for MSNBC, and how they set it up. And it kind of blows my mind how quickly we've been able to kind of set up these studios with lights that actually look fairly, and it works pretty well.
Let me give you a different perspective on this. I'm usually talking about economic data and economic numbers. I'm not a reporter in the sense that I go out on the streets to find the story. So I usually work with the data that the National Accounts Institute provides, or what the World Bank or whatever. One thing that is starting to worry me a lot in Mexico is, since all the face-to-face surveys have been stopped, we're not going to have a lot of information. And that's going to be a huge issue, because we all know that this particular crisis is going to hit very hard the employment system of every single country. And for example, the way that we in Mexico, we measure unemployment is with a face-to-face survey. So we won't have the data for the following months. And that's going to be an issue, because we won't have the information as it happens of what is going on with the job market right now. In the US, you have this insurance system where you ask for the financial support, the unemployment support. We don't have that. So we don't know how to keep track of what is going on with the labor market if we don't have that survey. So we can have one database that is produced in another institute, and we use that. But for example, the informality rate that is very high in Mexico, 56% of the job market is in the informal sector. That's people that don't pay taxes, or they are not affiliated to the Social Security. That is known with this survey, and we won't have that. So that's going to be an issue, and we're going to miss a lot of information. The consumer sentiment survey, we won't have those. And that's going to be a very huge issue, because apart from that, we have a very authoritarian regime right now, and that's going to be very difficult to handle in a couple of months. Just in the meantime, it's going to get difficult by the minute.
Yeah, that's great. I want to come back to the issue about politics in a moment, but I want to pick up on something you said about the numbers and talk more about the business of media. So how has the business of media been affected by this from your perspective? Has it been increased traffic, right? People are at home. You could imagine there's many more people watching, but there's also a reduction in actual activity. So there could be a loss in terms of advertising revenue as organizations pull back. How has the pandemic affected the business side of what you all do? And I want to start with you, Carol. Jump in there.
Yeah, we definitely have seen tons of increased traffic in both linear TV, radio, online. Absolutely, everything is just kind of off the charts. And so from that perspective, it's been wonderful. And I even just track it in terms of social media, just the amount of followers, because everybody's at home, everybody's just pulling in as much information as possible. So that's wonderful, right? But at the same time, initially, in terms of advertising, you didn't see anything happening. And I think the world was just like, nobody wanted to be running a spot. Everybody was kind of finding their way. And we're slowly starting to see that come back. And we were even seeing it too in terms of guests. I think initially CEOs weren't sure, how can they come out and say, I have no visibility? Because normally you would never do that to a business journalist. But now everybody understands everybody's in the same position. So people are increasingly coming out and talking. But I think we're finding our way. And going back to the business model, and that's not my world, but I do know that our folks have been looking at and trying to figure out, okay, if more people are going out to social, how do we kind of even provide kind of deeper dives into what's going on in the world and provide the kind of information that everybody seems to be wanting, not just kind of broad swipes, but, really specific information to give us a better understanding of what's going on. So, that's certainly, and so that's certainly happening. We're also kind of embracing the virtual world with conferences. Who would have thought? Usually we're at our headquarters or somewhere with hundreds of people, and now we're going online and doing conferences and finding we can have some really productive conversations, and perhaps that's a new revenue stream going forward.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else on how? I'm curious, Valeria. How's the model? How's it working in Mexico?
Well, in Mexico, the business model, and I think it happens pretty much the same in all the world. The media business model is more of a power business model. Like in some cases, at least in Mexico, the people who own the media, it's like they own many other things. It's just like one piece of the whole conglomerate. And media is being so powerful that it just gives you, the connections you need to power. And I think that model with the arrival of the new president was very challenged because the new president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, decided to, at least in the beginning, stop all the publicity advertising from the government to the regular TV stations or radio stations, and that was a huge issue for the regular networks. They weren't able to cope because they weren't used to that. Their business model depended on government advertisements, so it was very complicated for them. The government now opened a little bit, the faucet, and now the money is flowing again. But again, as Carol was saying, traffic has been incredible. It is still increasing by the second. It surprises me a lot from the perspective of radio. I listened to the radio, or I used to listen to the radio when I was driving. As I live in Mexico City, I spent a lot of my time driving. So I listened to a lot of radio in the car. And now I use the apps for the radio. I never thought I would do that. Never in my life. If you ask me, like in February, would you listen to the radio in an app? It's like, no. I mean, what's that? And now everybody is listening to the radio in the radio apps. So it's incredible. And of course, the social media thing, it's crazy. It's really crazy. You put one number out and it just becomes viral. So sometimes I'm talking about GDP, and GDP is like the trending topic. And I was like, why? It's GDP. So, but yeah, it's a very different time.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious about, given that media is a business, like how do you balance reporting a nuanced version of the truth with audience reach, right? So oftentimes what people want isn't necessarily a complicated view of reality, right? So how do you manage?
Can I just ask you, what's a nuanced version of the truth?
What's
like,
a nuanced version of the truth?
Truth is truth. Like, I
really,
find, so
really,
what do
Carol?
you mean? Yes.
Really? No, come on. Like, there's like a lot of detail that goes into the truth, right? There are different, I want to say I understand, like, look, there's the truth. And
there's balanced reporting where you do both sides, right?
I'm going to come to that. Really? Is there balanced reporting? Okay, let's get into it then. Here's the question. I have a question for you then on that. Let me jump.
No, Joe hasn't talked. It's his turn.
So how do you, what happens when politics becomes more important than truth, right? That you have tribal affiliations, the affiliations are so strong, they want to hear something that is aligned with what they believe about the world. And there are many things that are true that align with what they believe about the world, but you understand that they're going to see them through a certain lens, which will not be nuanced, right? But it's a big population and you're a business. Don't you want those people? Like, how do you engage with that? Like, don't you want the people who are like, don't you want that audience?
I mean, I think what we care about is truly the truth and not alternative facts, as was said a few years ago on Beat the Press. I mean, I think journalists truly do care about what is true, what we could show you is true, how we can take your hand and kind of guide you through why we know this is true, or what our sources are, or how we've come to this point, no matter whether people like it or not. I think what you're alluding to also is the fact that we live in this world now where people get information from places that say things that they like to hear. And sometimes those things aren't necessarily true, but they sort of believe essentially bad information or alternative information that's out there. I don't know if we can win those people over, and I don't know if our goal is to win them over through any other means than just to do our jobs and tell the truth and hope that kind of permeates through. It is why people want to watch us, is they know that we're going to check everything, report something that we have verified, and make sure we do get both sides, but also not just put something on the air or online or whatever that we know is not true, but it is something that someone said. So I think at the end of the day, that's still our guiding light before the pandemic, during the pandemic, and will be after the pandemic.
Right. I mean, let me go further. So we all agree, I think there's no disagreement that the COVID-19 originated in China. Right? I don't think there's any dispute about that. That would be what you would consider just a fact. But if someone says it's China's fault, is that a fact? Right? So I guess what I would say, this is what I mean, right? And there are people who would say like that is a fact, right? They would extrapolate from it started there into it's China's fault and list that as a fact. And there are people who would say that that doesn't live in the world of fact or not fact. That's something else. But we understand that there are a lot of people who, for a variety of reasons, would like to see it understood in that way. And if you're a news organization, if you report it in a particular way, you're going to get more people who want to believe that to pay attention to you than if you don't report it in that way. So that's just an example that's in this moment. But I guess what I would say is there's facts that we can all agree on, but there's so many places where the issue is not really fact or not fact, it's something else, and you can shade how you report one way or the other to attract different audiences.
We don't do that. Like, it's just, it's not in our ethos. Like, it's, and maybe it's because we deal so often, you know, we're about the financial markets, right? And we're about companies. So if we say something incorrect, it could potentially move a stock or move a commodity or move an asset. So we have to be really, really careful. I mean, before we can go to air with something, or before we can put something in print, I mean, the editors, I mean, how many people have to, you know, confirm something? They're so careful because, you know, it will have an impact potentially on a company or you know, somebody's investment. So we have to be really careful. And you know, people for better or worse sometimes think Bloomberg's a little bland, but we try to be very careful about being very straight. And do we have a whole area that's Bloomberg opinion? Absolutely. And you're going to get all different perspectives. But, you know, from the get-go, when you read an article or you hear a recording, you know it's opinion. So you know it's coming from a certain perspective. And I think, you know, when I started journalism, that's how you did it. You know, you had an issue and you would talk to both sides and you hopefully presented a story and you let somebody make up their mind. And it's gotten really messy, which we don't do that anymore. And that's unfortunate. It's almost like we don't respect public enough to say, here are the arguments, like a great debate. You figure out, you know, kind of which way you want to go on an issue. And that's unfortunate. But we're straight.
My freshman year in college, I took a class called History and Issues of Journalism. And it's one of the first things you learn is the importance of hearing other viewpoints that may not match with yours. And there are reasons for that. The first of which is it helps you defend why you believe what you believe. And the second is when you hear someone else's argument, you may start to think a little differently about the issue. And that's why it's so important in journalism. My fear is more and more people don't want that. They don't want to hear another side. They don't even want to critically think and engage with that. And I think that is just a problem in society. I know our network tries to do a good job of presenting both sides and making sure we have that. There are simply people who maybe don't want to hear another side these days. And that's not good, because journalism is really about getting people to think critically about more than one way of doing something or approaching something.
How do you keep from falling into false equivalence, right? So both sides is like, that sounds great, right? But what if one side, whatever that side is not, I mean, they're not truthful, but not reasonable. Let's say it doesn't align with the scientific consensus, but it's another side. And let's say it's well represented in the society. Like, do you present both sides and you present them equivalently?
Well, let me jump here. I think it's becoming real complicated to do this. And I agree with you that sometimes, I mean, with the example that you were saying that the virus comes from China, or is it China's fault? Of course, it's like editorializing the news. And at the beginning of this thing in Mexico, of this pandemic in Mexico, I started to track the number of tests that we were doing as a country. And it was just kind of like an experiment, but I didn't mean it to be an experiment. So I just put out the number of tests that we were doing. And it just became crazy because people started, first of all, telling me that if I was an epidemiologist, or why was I supposed to be giving that number out? And it's like, it's an official number. I'm just like putting it out, but it's there. You just have to look for it. And all kinds of criticism arose. It's like, I was crazy. What was I talking about the test? And then the president said that testing was not needed. And the scientific in charge of the pandemic in Mexico, Dr. Lopez, he said that we didn't need to do any tests. So we're doing very, 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 very little tests. And then the question is, why are you reporting the tests? Do you want to hit the president? Do you want to hit the way that they are handling the pandemic? And so I tried to put these numbers out, just like, this is the number of tests that we are doing. And then I realized that people didn't want to hear that. They wanted me to give an opinion on that number. So that became really complicated. It's like, if I said we're doing this number of tests, it's like, well, is it good? Is it bad? I mean, we can compare, but what does it mean for the people? So people, of course, need the truth. We need to give the truth. But then again, sometimes you need to explain it. And when you start to explain whatever the truth is, you're starting to editorialize the truth. And then it becomes really complicated.
Because I would also even so I think the editorializing is right. And there's also a tone issue, right? Even for the, going back to Carol for just a second, even when you're just doing reporting on the, on what's going on in business, like just facts, right? So you brought up that I think Moderna has the things in trial right now, right? There's a way in which you could talk about it that is truthful and accurate, but gives a sense of more excitement that might affect how people understand it, right? So there's these small nuances in terms of not just what you're saying, but how you say it even, that can have big effects on people's response to it. So I think a great example is Valeria, like once you explain, you start to editorialize, but even things that seem self-explanatory, given how you describe them or how your tone can have an effect on people's response to it. How do you manage that?
Or choosing to not include something, like even with Moderna, and to not say, well, wait a minute, folks, there's still a phase 3, and that's the complicated part of the process. And that normally takes several years. If you choose to, and some of it is, I'm not a doctor, but I have learned a heck of a lot because of this process, and you just kind of have to. But if you're not familiar with what it takes to get a drug to the market, or at least the typical way, you can just neglect some information that tells a fuller and more accurate story. And maybe that's where it becomes a little bit nuanced, and maybe it comes across, so we could just come out and say, Moderna, look at it, the stock's up, the market's up, everything's great. We know that's not the case, but if you neglect some of the important parts of kind of the drug approval process, then you're telling a different story. And so you do have to be careful about what you include and what you exclude. Absolutely.
So I was gonna go to it, and I said I promised to come back to politics. I'm gonna move there now. I'm sure everybody's excited to talk about politics.
What politics? There's no politics going on.
It's only reporting of truth. How do you deal with, I think this is happening all over the world, actually, like a rise in nationalism and populism. Like, how do you think about that in the context of reporting the truth, right? That's how is it affecting how people are responding to you? So for example, I'll just throw out a bunch of things you can respond to any or all of these. There's a growing distrust, some suggest, of the media. And maybe you could tie that to polarization and increase in kind of these strains of nationalism or the strains of populism, because people have such strong beliefs about what is true, or even more problematically, maybe what should be true, what they would like to be true. How do you manage that, or how have you all been thinking about that? I'll go to Valeria, because I think she might have touched on some of those things earlier.
Well, what can I tell you? In Mexico, we have a populist president. It's not a judge. He describes himself as such. And it's becoming very complicated. Whenever we put economic information out there, or financial information out there, official government information out there, he says that it's not relevant, that it's not important, that he has other data. And every single day, and when I talk about every single day, I'm not exaggerating, it's every single day, he says that he has other data. Nobody knows what that other data is. But for example, he gives a morning conference every day from 7 to 9, something like that. Maybe it goes to 9:30. And then he gives, not personally, but his team, another 3 press conferences every single day. One of them is directed to address the pandemic, the information and the numbers and that. Everything is becoming really polarized, even in the questions, because in the press conference, you have, of course, the press. But the media outlets that are invited to those conferences, you don't even know them. It's like, do they exist? Sometimes I have to Google them because I've never heard of them. And then they target the questions specifically, very, very specific. So you might have questions like, is the science that we're doing in Mexico neoliberal? It's like, what are they talking about? Science is science. And then you start to talk about, is it better to use ventilators made in Mexico, or we can buy ventilators all over the world? And it's like, why are we having this discussion? So things are becoming complicated in the way of reporting. And I see every single day that we are creating echo chambers. So we fill ourselves with information that we want to prove our own points. And it's very difficult to try to see what other people say or what other people think. And that makes polarization even worse. In Mexico, it's getting increasingly violent. It's not, I mean, I'm worried that it eventually translates into the real life, because the things that people say on social media, I just can't believe them. It's from a level of aggression and violence that I have never, ever in my life seen. And that worries me, because I mean, at the end of all this, we are still a country, and we are all Mexicans, and we will keep on living here. And we don't want to be that polarized, because we're going to go eventually out to the supermarket and meet with people. So from my point of view, it's getting very worrisome, at least in Mexico.
Well, and what's unfortunate is, you know, we see it in politics. I mean, that's the understatement, right, of the last few years, the division. I remember, I know our student body here is pretty young, but I'm sure they know Alan Greenspan, you know, well-known Fed chairman, but he talked about in the 70s when he started his career that he would go to a function and it would be half Democrats, half Republicans, you know, and everybody would socialize together, and then they would work on legislation together. And you don't have that anymore. Now you go to a gathering and it's, you know, all Republicans or all Democrats. People don't respect other opinions. And then that just kind of trickles down to the populace. And I have to say, you know, you talk about, okay, I said I'm a straight shooter from Bloomberg, but when it comes to populism and nationalism, I think that's where something as journalists, you know, to some extent we have to be out front and center, because we have these huge issues. Look at the pandemic. You need global cooperation. We know that. Thank God you have the global medical community working to get a vaccine. And let's hope that it's not, you know, China came out and said, if, you know, we get a vaccine, right, I think we're going to provide it to the world, you know, but people saying, well, maybe I'm only going to give it to my country or something, like that's crazy. You know, we have climate change. We have some really huge, massive issues that there needs to be, where not everybody's just looking inward, they're looking outward. And it really is, I feel like as a journalist, I have to say that's one issue where I maybe get a little bit more subjective, because I really think it's important. It's an important, you know, part of our time. And I think I'm not so sure that I don't know. That's one thing where I get a little heated on air about, because I just think we really have some important issues in front of us. And if we don't work on it together, we're not going to get it done, and the outcomes are terrible, as we're seeing where we are today.
And with, I think, a pandemic, we're seeing that face masks are polarized and politicized. How we reopen is polarized and politicized. I think part of it is just that's the nature of where we were entering this pandemic, and those sides have just solidified, if not perhaps even more. I think it's also the fact that there is still a lot of uncertainty about this virus. Like, we still don't know everything about it. There's so many unanswered questions about it. And the fact that there are still things we're always learning, and the fact that it's evolving, I think maybe gives some people permission to say, well, we don't know everything, so I don't have to wear my face mask, or I don't have to, or we can reopen faster, or all these different arguments that are happening. I think maybe some of the reason they happen is because people, we can say, there's still so many things we don't know about it. For us, one of the most important things we do as journalists is really, when we talk to the experts, really try to talk to who are the leading experts on these issues, with the science, with the economics and all that, noting that we still don't know everything, and that there are still some unanswered questions, and acknowledging what we don't know. We don't know much about antibodies right now, so it's hard to make a lot of things. We don't know how many asymptomatic people have had this. Acknowledging the things we don't know, but also saying, here's still what the experts and the scientists and the leading people in this industry and in these areas say about what we should and shouldn't be doing right now.
And so what do you think about, now I'm just going to think about the role of power. So now that we're going through the COVID pandemic, right? So Kira, you made a great point of being really impassioned about the need for global cooperation. But when people in power are not in that place, how do you engage with that productively, right? Because what they say has to be reported on, right? Because in some sense, that's where we've been, that because they're in power, what they say has to be reported on. And sometimes what they say is not aligned with, let's say, global cooperation or what might be in the best interest of the society. How do you engage with people in positions of power under those circumstances?
Well, it's interesting. Going back to something Joe said, like I do think about the voices we have on, and I want to make sure, whether, especially in the medical community or even the corporate community, whatever, is that you have the right voices on all the topics, so that despite what might be saying by political leadership or leadership in general, you want to make sure that the folks that you put on air are really kind of the best in their field, so that when someone's listening, they're like, okay, wait, these people know what they're talking about. And I feel that very much with the medical community. Like, you want to make sure, we just had on Dr. Hazeltine, Bill Hazeltine. He created a ton of companies, biotech companies. He worked in Wuhan, and this is someone who worked on past viruses. Like, you want people who have been on the front lines, who understand what's going on. And so, you're trying to get the right authorities on everything. So despite, it's, Brian, it's tricky. And we make it a mission to carry all of the press conferences, like on the virus task force, and we cover a big chunk of them. We've kind of backed off a little bit as they've backed off as well. But we cover them and put them out there for the public to hear. And then my goal and my mission every day is to just get the smartest and brightest voices on whether it's medicine, whether it's what's going on in the airline industry, what's going on with hotels, and that leave it to people to kind of filter through and figure out, hopefully, the right voices to listen to.
Something else I've noticed is sometimes people who say the most outrageous things are more likely to get covered, right? And so this is independent of...
Don't you feel like he's working around one little thing?
So I just wonder, how do you keep from being manipulated? Is it how do you maintain the focus on truth when there are things that are being, all kinds of people, right? So I've just been reading recently about a physician in France who's getting a lot of attention because he's making claims about a cocktail of drugs that might be effective. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't, but it's clear that his claims are really strong, right, and really powerful. So it's hard. You can easily imagine why you'd feel the need to report on that. And I just wonder, how do you in the media manage that sort of pressure? How do you keep from finding yourself in a place where you're reporting these things because they're so, for lack of a better term, newsworthy, because the people are designing them that way? Joe, you want to jump in there?
Sure. I don't know about this example with the cocktail overseas. I think context is important for us. So if I don't think we always do listen to the loudest voice. Sometimes the loudest voice does get attention because they go viral or something like that. Maybe sometimes we feel a responsibility then to say, okay, this person said this, are they right or wrong? And then we can look at whatever it is that person said and explain why it's right or why it's wrong and talk to the experts. We're pretty good at, just because we hear something that's headline worthy or outrageous or something, of then checking with the people who we know these topics well, to say, is there something to this, or is there not something to it? And if there's, if the consensus is there's absolutely nothing to it, then we shouldn't give that person any voice at all. And sometimes social media alone is so powerful these days, it doesn't need a mainstream media outlet to push it to the surface, which is why we have conspiracy theories right now. The mainstream media doesn't give those oxygen, but a lot of people believe these things, especially with social media. So we have a responsibility to sort of look at those things and say, is it something worth giving any time to? Is it something worth having a discussion about and explaining why it may or may not work? That's our job. We're the gatekeepers. Just because something is out there and making a big deal, we have to decide if it's important for our audience and what they need to know about it.
Mm-hmm. So I'll ask a broader question. Is I think maybe it's more requiring you to make an assessment about how, as a field, you all have done. So again, I would say that there's been an increasing challenge to media, right? So there's been social media, things going viral that is hard for what is now called the mainstream media to respond to as quickly as these things happen. Do you think the media has done a good job? Right, so there's been a lot of things that have happened in the world and politics, and now obviously the most important thing here is in this the pandemic. Has it done a good job in serving its function in terms of keeping people informed, helping people make good decisions in democratic systems, helping possibly create cooperation globally when it's in the service of individuals' lives? Has the media, in your mind, done a good job? That's one. And then what could it do better? Like, where do you feel like it's not done the best job it could have over the last, I don't know, let's call it not just the pandemic, but let's say the last 10 years or so? What do you think?
Let me jump into the second part of the question, and I'll let the first part of the question to Joe and Carol.
Not fair.
No, I mean, what I think that media should try harder to make things easier to understand for people. I know it's a huge challenge. I know when we're talking about biological stuff and a virus that we don't know, that it's changing, that it's new, that at first it affected the respiratory system and then the kidneys and then the brain, and then you don't understand anything. It might give, open the possibility of a lot of confusion. And of course, the education level is different in different states, in different countries. So from what I see in Mexico, I would like media to use the relevant information, but to simplify it, to use a kind of language. I mean, not to dilute it, not to talk to people like if they were kids, but to use a kind of language that everybody understands. Because if you go into very technical issues or very sophisticated medical terms, and I think you end up confusing people. And at times like this, people, and of course, including ourselves, need some certainties about something. And at least understanding the information that is out there might be useful. So that's one thing that I think media can improve on. But well, Joe, Carol, that's your turn.
That's very hopeful. I love your faith in people, Valeria.
Well, and I will say we do something called quick takes, and I think we've amped them up a little bit because of the virus, which is basically, here's the situation, here's why you need to know about it, and let's explain the nuances of it. And so, I think you're right that we have to make sure that we help explain something. I mean, everybody throws around terms and just assumes everybody understands it. And especially with the virus, like there are, intricacies and levels where you really have to dive into to truly understand it. At the same time, I'm going to say the onus is also on consumers, because I was reading some information to prep for this, and just talks about how many people get, most of their information from social media, and they often rely on recaps and summaries rather than digging deeper into a story. And so the onus is on you to spend some time really reading a story. I mean, enterprise, journalism, it's really important. And you can't just read the first couple paragraphs or read a summary or a headline. And so, we have to make sure we're providing all those deep dives, but the consumer out there, the mass public, needs to read it and go deeper into stories so that they really understand something. I really feel like it's a two-way street here. And I think
Carol,
we've done a great job.
Carol, how many times do you tweet or put something out there that's obviously just a headline or whatever and links to an article, and then the person responds with some criticism, and you're like, if you literally read the article I just tweeted, it's actually
right. Read the story.
Yeah, that's true. That's
exactly.
Completely true.
Exactly.
So here's the question: if you know they aren't reading it, and your job is to inform them, where does that leave you? Like, how do you think about your responsibility? It's tough. So I'm curious how you think about that. And there's also worse than that, right? Because there's some studies that came out that false news, for example, spreads easier than truth. So these are things that we know. So if you're in the business of promoting truth out there, and this is the world in which we live right now, do you think there's a need to change the model in some way? Should we be trying different things given the challenges that we're facing? And if so, what might that be?
Wow, that's a great question.
It's hard because you can't control. I mean, it's very hard to just I can't just sit there on the news and scream, no, I'm right, listen to me, not the fake news, you know, because first of all, you have some people in institutional power who are calling mainstream media fake news. And that is hard sometimes to argue with people who say that, because there are people who believe that, and you don't know how to prove otherwise. It's actually a good question. I think it's something we're going to have to think about. You know, we talk a lot about how much falls onto Twitter and Facebook to try to get rid of things that are false. I can give you quickly a personal experience. I was, when the Las Vegas shooting happened a few years ago, I just so happened to be in Las Vegas. We were covering the release of O.J. Simpson from prison that weekend. And I happened to be staying in the Mandalay Bay Tower that night. And the shooting happened 6 floors below me. And we were trapped all night long in this room, broadcasting live with our phones, kind of figuring things out as we went. What was fascinating to me was in the months that followed, I found out that conspiracy theorists who didn't think what happened, who thought like the government was involved and there was a helicopter that was shooting people and all this stuff, used our reports to try to raise these issues and questions and tried to say, why was a reporter there? And they took everything I said and edited it in a way that twisted it to what was not reality. And clearly they knew they were doing that. I don't know how to argue against that. I don't know what to say when someone's making an argument that I'm in on a government conspiracy of the deep state that was part of the Las Vegas shooting. I can just say I didn't do it and honestly just not engage with those people, because I think lifting them up or giving them more attention doesn't help. So it is a frustrating thing because people are out there saying things that you know are not true. I don't know how to convince them otherwise. And that's a challenge I think we face right now.
Yeah, I don't know what the answer is. I mean, I don't know, but I do think there's a responsibility. If you have a network and you're informing the public, there's a responsibility to make sure that the information you put out there is accurate. And so I don't know, how do you, I'm not, saying that we should do more government oversight. I'm not advocating for that, but I do wonder, you go back, I don't know, a couple decades or a few years ago, there was a responsibility if you had a network on air, whether it was cable, whether it was, a straight network. And I just do wonder, I don't know what the answer is. I think it's a great question. But I've never been in an environment, and I feel like, it was kicked off with the 2016 election, where this whole idea of fake news, where it came from. And I think it's either anger with our society. I mean, there's some really deep problems right now that I think we have ignored as a society, and I think they need to be dealt with. I think there are a public that hasn't been heard. And I think we need to be, as journalists, make sure that we are telling everyone's stories. I mean, one of the things during the financial crisis, it was easy to talk to the bankers and tell that big story, right? But when you sat down with somebody in Florida, an old, woman who was in her 70s, who was losing her home because she didn't read the fine print, I mean, that's when it struck you. And there's a responsibility to make sure you tell all the stories. And I do also think there's pressure on news organizations right now, financially. And I think we have to be, just very, very careful that we all don't chase the same stories and go for the headline grabbing story. And there's a responsibility on all of us, to dig deeper.
Great. I'm gonna like follow up on that right now and give you an opportunity.
Darn.
So let's go back to what's going on right now. I'm curious. Well, Joe pointed out that COVID has touched everything, right? Politics, sports, climate, business, everything. I'd love to hear from you either a story that you've covered or one that you did not or yet not had the chance to cover that you'd like to tell us about. Something that's interesting, surprising, something that is maybe not the main focus, but an important story that you'd like to hear talked about, or that you've already talked about, but you'd like for us to hear about it now.
Well, I can start with a simple one. It's very simple. Today in Mexico, 324 municipalities were set to open up their regular normal life. And when I say normal life, it's not a new normal, it's like the regular normal. You can go back to school and you can go back to the street and you can shop, and of course, no face mask restriction, anything at all. And it was announced by the government as a huge issue because there were no COVID cases there. And it was made like, there are no COVID cases there, so it's great because, I mean, they're like clean. So they can open up and keep on with their lives. The thing is that in 70% of these municipalities, no tests whatsoever have been done. 0 tests. So of course there aren't any COVID cases because there haven't been any testing whatsoever. So that's the issue right now. So we opened up, it's not a very big part of the country, but we opened up a part of the country, you know, like blindly, with no information whatsoever of what's going on. And that's a story that I talked about today. As I told you, I talk only about data. So that's the thing that we covered today. And it was kind of astounding. How are you going to open with no information at all? And yet we did.
Right.
I've been tasked with a lot of our human interest stories just because I'm writing is one of my favorite things. So I've been tasked with telling actually some of the more uplifting things and things like that, which has been good. The one that stands out most to me was there was a nurse who worked at that nursing home near Seattle that ended up being the first epicenter in our country. So she, in the days before they realized COVID had arrived there, she herself had gotten sick. And she stayed home from work because she was sick, and that's what you do. And then they started to diagnose the people there had COVID. And then she realized that was what she had. She had COVID and she was sick, not overly sick, but she had to sit at home and basically watch on the news every night to see all these people she knew and cared for pass away or get very sick. It was very hard for her because she felt so helpless. And so finally, weeks and weeks later, the one thing she could do was she could donate her plasma when she was healthy enough to do so. And so we were able to go with her, our crew did, to do that. And I thought it was just a powerful moment of someone who, first of all, she was 79 years old and still nurse. She was in her 70s. She's still nursing. She's just a wonderful woman. So you just fell in love with her the moment you heard from her. But she wanted to do this, and I just thought it was a powerful story to hear from someone who just wanted to help in whatever way they could and felt helpless about it. I think moving forward in the coming weeks, one of the more important things the media can do is really, as this country reopens so quickly in some places, is really just be keeping track of what's happening, because now is where we find out what the next stage is. Do we have a second wave? Do we have big increases? Do we not? And how do our leaders respond to that? Because we're seeing every state handling this so differently. And I think we're going to have a very important responsibility on keeping tabs of what's happening where, and then keeping the leaders in those areas accountable for what are the steps they're going to take if there are increases in areas.
Two quick things. I'm going to piggyback on what Joe said, and that, you know, the vulnerabilities that have been laid bare by the virus, they've been there for a long time, but we have really seen them, you know, and I just think it's time to take care of these things, that people who don't have safety nets, you know, people who are not making a living wage, like, it's ridiculous. Here we are in this really rich country, and yet it's just horrible and horrific, what we've seen with the virus. It's not right. And you know, it's not new situations. We've been talking about it for years, but you know, we're all kind of being shocked by it. And I think it's time that, you know, our policymakers really do something to improve the plight of many. That's one thing. And the other thing is the food chain. I am like blown away. I think we just all take for granted, myself included, where food comes, but to see, you know, food being laid to waste because it wasn't being, you know, restaurants weren't using it. And then we had people who couldn't feed themselves, that we weren't able to somehow make this supply chain for food to get people. There's that, and just the whole industry of food production. There's a lot that I think we need to uncover there, because I just think it's an old model, and it doesn't necessarily work the way it should, I think. So I'd love to kind of dig into that story. So don't do it, Joe. Or Valeria. Either of you.
Well, great. I really appreciate you all taking the time. It's really incredible things happening right now in the world. And I really appreciate the work that you all do and helping us stay informed. I know I spend a lot of my time on media trying to keep abreast of what's happening. And the work that people like you do is really important. So thank you for that. And thank you for participating in this class. Really appreciate it.